I remember almost 20 years ago dating my wife, and I remember the moment I first held her hand. The first time my clammy, sweaty palm touched her clammy, sweaty palm, and it was just powerful. I mean, that experience of our skin touching just on a hand level was a rush of adrenaline. But if I'm honest, we held hands 4 or 5 times over that next week. Just didn't have the feeling, the power that first time I held her hand had. And in some way, I feel community can be like that. Community is powerful and is certainly has moments of electricity and rich experiences of belonging and emotional connectedness. But in many ways, community can then become ordinary and daily. And it just doesn't have the power in return that it initially had or that we think it's supposed to have. We use this term, I'm going to write it here on the whiteboard, this term called the law of diminishing. I think that's diminishing, returns. And this is an engineering term to talk about how when something initially has high return, is potent, is packed full of energy, but the more that you do it, that initial return, that initial power, that initial energy diminishes. The return diminishes over time. When we talk about community, many of us think that community is supposed to always have that initial return. It's supposed to always feel powerful. The return is supposed to feel deep. Our connection is always supposed to feel tight and very real. But the reality is that community over time loses its sexiness, loses its strength. And it has seasons to it where at times it's very significant and other times it just seems to be limping along. When we look at community and we have expectations around how it should function and what return we should receive from it, we're building ourselves up for some serious disappointment. When we import expectations on community, when we download our ideals of how community should function, we'll find ourselves perpetually frustrated. There's some common expectations and ideals that I've watched over the years in helping form community. I just want to give you some common ones because I think that if they're common to my experiences and to some of the experiences of community I've had, then they're probably going to be common for you. The first common ideal or expectation we have is that community, I'm going to do it for short there, community is about friendship. This ideal, this concept that community is about friendship seems so natural, seems so organic, seems so normal, but it is an inappropriate expectation in community. Friendship is often about affinity. Affinity are the things that we have in common, the likenesses that we have. Let me just be honest with you. One of my impulses here is that I don't like ultimate fighting. So if you like ultimate fighting, that's cool. But that's one of the things I can't stand. I just can't stand ultimate fighting. I can't stand boxing. I'm just not into that stuff. So it's hard for me to bond with somebody really closely if they want to watch that stuff all the time. I think that's okay. That's friendship. That's in the realm of friendship. We naturally gravitate towards people that we have stuff in common with, that are like us in some ways. And naturally we gravitate away from people that we don't have a lot in common with, that don't have a lot of likeness with us. So when we build community upon this idea that we're all going to be friends, you're really headed into a cement wall. Because friendship is not strong enough to hold community together. Friendship is fickle and picky and choosy and a little bit ornery about who it wants to bond with and who it doesn't want to bond with. Community cannot be built on friendship. Now here's the cool thing that I've observed is that communities that sustain over a period of time, people that wouldn't typically be friends eventually become friends. But friendship is not the core bond of community. I mean, imagine in the early church that now Jew and Gentile are in the same community. They would never have been friends, but now they're in this community, having to form a life together. You know, in the temple before, in Judaism, men would walk into the temple and say, "Thank God I'm not a Gentile or a woman." Because in their culture, those were derogatory things. And now all of a sudden you're a follower of Jesus and you're in a community with a Gentile and a woman, and you're supposed to share mutual love. You're supposed to live and coexist with each other. The early church community was not made up of friends. It was not. And that bond of friendship is not strong enough to weather the seasons of community. That's one expectation that you need to set aside. Friendship is like the cherry on top of the ice cream. Another expectation is that community is natural. You know, in our society, my wife loves organic food. We love to be natural. We like to shop at our local farmer's market. We like things that have not been chemically engineered. And so we can easily kind of import that into community that, and I've heard this quite a bit in my travels a little bit, is that when it gets difficult, we think there must be something wrong. We think that if it takes work and there's collision and there's conflict and there's a bit of gear grinding in the formation of community, then something must be wrong. If you've read 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, which is really the first intentional church plant, you'll see that community was something they had to fight for. It was ripe with heads bumping and gears grinding. If they thought that community was just supposed to happen naturally and organically, then it never would have formed. We have to set this aside that somehow community is something that's just going to happen, and that it shouldn't be difficult. Community is something you become intentional about, and you have to begin to, in some sense, fight for. It becomes something worth sacrificing for. It goes against our comfort. Those are two expectations that people often hold on to. The other and last expectation is that community is about having my needs met. This is probably the most common ideal, is that community is going to meet my emotional material needs. When we enter an interface with community based on that kind of love, it really distorts, and in some sense it's not love, it's a bit of an insidious form of selfishness. And we look at all those relationships that we have in front of us as people that are supposed to meet my needs. When we interact that way, we erode the foundation of community. And we look at all relationships through that lens. So much so that any grace that's given to us falls into a black hole and disappears, because our needs are never being met enough. You can't view community that way, or it will not sustain. These three issues in community are probably the most common expectations and ideals. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, one of his most powerful statements, is that our ideals and expectations on community can be the very thing that kill community. I want you to think about one of these three, and maybe one of these three are where you collide with you the most, are on the tip of your tongue, are something that is a struggle for you. But essentially, community is not a selfish endeavor. It is a others-oriented endeavor. And expectations need to be set aside for us to share a common life where Jesus is king and we can genuinely practice unselfish love towards one another.